What's up, guys? Michael here. Today, we're gonna look at arguably the very best thing to ever start in the UK and relocate to America. And we're not talking about your favorite prince turned tech bro. That's right, The Office. The show about a medium-sized paper company populated by eclectic workers only ran for 2 seasons in the UK, but became one of contemporary American television's most iconic offerings.
Parkour! 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 Parkour!
Now, we're not interested in arguing which is better, but for as much as the shows are the same, we're interested in how they're different and how those differences change their meaning. And specifically, we're wondering, did the US Office accidentally teach us to love our jobs? We'll explain in this Wisecrack Edition on how The Office changed. But before we get into it, we wanted to take a second and tell you about the only non-digital thing we make here at Wisecrack: merch. I mean, you still have to order it digitally, but you get my point. We have everything from t-shirts to hoodies, coffee mugs to hats. Basically, everything you need to be dressed from the waist up and drinking a warm beverage while you consume your favorite content. And right now, if you head to wisecrack.store and use code Wisecrack15, you can get 15% off your order. So why not grab some merch today? And then maybe wear it while doing something really cool and send us pictures and we'll put them up in our office. Or not, it's your merch and your life. So visit wisecrack.store and use code Wisecrack15 today for 15% off. Now, back to the show. Now, in its earliest days, the US Office was pretty faithful to its British counterpoint. Early episodes lifted jokes and plot lines directly from the original. It also copied its grainy look and downbeat, disenchanted style. But as the show evolved, the US Office developed a much brighter, cheerier look and feel. Between seasons 1 and 2, Steve Carell even stopped going bald. The UK Office, on the other hand, was always a comedy of cruelty, defined by the performance of its creator, Ricky Gervais.
I don't care if you're black, brown, yellow. Orientals make very good workers, for example.
Like his American equivalent, Michael Scott, David Brent was a self-centered fool who thought of himself as a comedian and musician. In his words,
someone who's basically a chilled-out entertainer.
That's despite his complete lack of talent. But Michael, while often lazy, cowardly, and offensive, was also a pretty nice guy who just wanted his employees to be his friends.
Jim and I are great friends. We hang out a ton, mostly at work.
He was even, despite his many flaws, an excellent salesman and a surprisingly effective manager. Brent, by contrast, was not only a lot more obviously incompetent, he was also capable of being genuinely nasty.
She's chilled out a bit more, shouldn't she? Maybe a bit of the old ganja. Do you know what I mean? Of course you do. Oh.
On the US Office, Michael's skill as a salesman earned him his position as branch manager. In contrast, on the UK Office, Brent being the boss makes most sense in relation to the fact that Wernham Hogg, the UK's equivalent of Dunder Mifflin, is clearly a boys' club where workplace bullying is largely tolerated.
My kids are gonna sing those!
In the US Office, there are barely any overt references to the actual documentary crew, at least up until the final season, when both the process of filming and the release of the documentary become major plot points. Throughout most of the show's run, the mockumentary format feels like a stylistic as opposed to a narrative choice. But in the UK Office, which pioneered the mockumentary sitcom style, the fact that the action is being filmed for a TV series is referenced much more frequently.
Well, don't do that. Well, eat it out. There's people starving in the world, which I hate. So, and it's a waste.
So while Michael Scott spends most of his time trying to impress and win over his employees, not an imaginary audience, David Brent is much more obviously motivated by a desire to achieve fame via this documentary. In the final episodes of the original series, which are set around a year after the documentary aired, Brent, having been fired from Wernham Hogg, is seen getting by on personal appearances at depressing suburban nightclubs.
Shagadelic, baby. Groovy. Oh, yeah.
But even leaving Brent aside, the British Office has less sympathetic characters than the US version. For example, in the US Office, Pam's original fiancé Roy is far from the greatest guy in the world, but he has nothing on his British equivalent Lee. Where Roy is a bit of a dick about Christmas presents.
I was gonna get you one of these for Christmas. I don't have to. It'd save a ton of money.
So what are you gonna get me instead?
I don't know. Maybe like a sweater or something?
Lee refuses to even get anything for Dawn.
What I usually say to her is sort of work out what she spent on me and then just take it out of my wallet.
Meanwhile, Lee's boss, Glynn, who as the warehouse manager is technically the equivalent of Daryl, is a lazy, careless bigot.
You think we care as much about your baby as you do? Just because you let some useless blows beans up your.
He's the polar opposite of the sensitive, hardworking, and extremely talented Daryl, whose value is increasingly recognized as the show goes on. In the US office, even Dwight, who often makes his colleagues' lives miserable, proved capable of building genuinely warm relationships with many of them. The character he was based on, Gareth, never achieved any such thing.
All right, I'll ask you straight. Is there anything that could happen between us two while this is going on?
Like what?
What specifically?
Yeah.
Hand job?
But perhaps more than anything else, the UK office is darker and more depressing than its American equivalent because it features people who are, well, believably at work. Now, the US office does make the occasional concession to economic reality. The branch is regularly threatened with closure, for example.
I'm here to tell you that we are closing the Scranton branch.
There have been talks about closing the Buffalo branch.
Binghamton branch closed last night. All the clients are up for grabs.
Still, most work days on the show are spent pranking each other, planning parties, or falling in love. The characters are even able to leave their desks for a quick game of genital tag in the warehouse. Kevin is often depicted as being wildly incompetent, an accountant who is given to inventing his own numbers to make the books work.
He used to call it a Clevin. He told Dwight, a mistake plus Clevin gets you home by 7. He was home by 4:45 that day.
And then there's Creed, who is, well, he's Creed.
Decapitated, whole big thing. We had a funeral for a bird.
I'm pretty sure none of that's real.
You're not real, man.
Even if the characters do ever undertake any actual work, for instance by going on a sales call, this usually just precipitates some sort of wacky adventure. While pranking does go down in the UK office, the characters are much better at avoiding their boss's distractions. While office romances do take place, the characters never really become friends. Mostly, they just bore each other.
Boring, isn't it? Just staying in watching peak practice with your life.
Yeah.
Not for me. I don't like it.
Yeah, I just stayed in, had a big wank.
When the characters do socialize outside of work, it is typically in situations which are drab and depressing, such as a crappy nightclub, or a quiz night which takes place in a windowless room in their office park. In the UK version then, work is depicted as a necessary evil, something that you have to do in order to survive. Whenever characters try to escape it, such as Brent trying to be famous, or the show's gym equivalent, Tim, deciding he's going to quit to study psychology, things start going wrong. Brent becomes a sort of D-list celebrity, but is super hated. Tim, meanwhile, never really dares to quit, instead accepting a token promotion in order to convince himself that he's making a mature, adult decision.
And if I do a bit of networking, then there's every chance I could be in David's chair in 3 years, so.
In many ways, then, the understanding of work presented by the UK office reflects Karl Marx thinking about why work sucks. Early on in his philosophical career, Marx was very influenced by German philosopher George Hegel, who tells us in The Philosophy of Right that work offers us a practical education, forming us as the sort of person who is able to perform some specific useful task, allowing us to be recognized as a definite someone in the eyes of others. Marx takes that understanding of work and applies it to a world where the only someone you can become is a wildly exploited Victorian factory worker making poverty wages. Or, for our purposes, a super bored mid-tier paper salesman. Now, according to Marx, work has an alienating effect on us, and it can make our labor, our relationships, and even our sense of self feel all weird and out of whack. And he thinks it does this in 4 different ways. First, it makes us feel alienated from the product of our labor, because we're being paid to do something that doesn't really benefit our lives, and just ends up serving the interest of someone else.
I can't take another boring call about Spar White index board at 230 a ton, so...
260.
No, you're a twat. Okay, shut up.
Even if Jim occasionally lands a big commission, only David Wallace and the board members are seeing the real fruit of all the Scranton branch's labor. Next, work alienates us from the labor process itself. At a big or medium-sized paper company, workers perform some discrete function. They make sales, or balance books, or spend their time doing whatever Creed does. Meanwhile, they have little, if any, idea of what anyone else in the company does. A fact made particularly obvious in both versions of The Office by the upstairs office having little to no idea of what goes on in the warehouse.
We'll get somebody to clean that up.
We're the ones that gotta clean that up.
For Marx, you are alienated from your labor when you never really know how the business you work for actually functions. This ends up making everything you do all day feel both repetitive and meaningless. Also, if you understand how the YouTube algorithm works, hit me up in the comments. Please. So through work, we end up becoming alienated from our labor power, which separates us from something that Marx thinks is essential to our humanity. This is huge because our labor power doesn't just define us as individuals. It's also what makes us human. Our ability to work, Marx tells us, is the thing that separates us from the animals. This is because work allows us to exercise conscious control over our environment, leaving us free to act creatively on it, unlike animals who struggle to simply survive and reproduce. This is the third form of alienation. Alienation from what Marx calls our human species being. And in case you're wondering what that looks like,
well, first of all, I don't have coworkers anymore, I have subordinates.
Which gets us to the final stage of alienation. Estrangement from one another. In a professional context, no matter how often our boss calls us bro, we still exist as isolated competitors. My colleague's failure is a chance for me to shine. Stuck together in the office all day, we exist in conditions ripe for mutual resentments to form.
Here we go. I've told you before, you can't tell me what to do, I'm team leader.
Through work then, Marx says, we may become sad, empty, lonely, and essentially inhuman, endlessly competing with each other for finite resources or some scrap of approval from our bosses. Work is doing this to us, but we also have no other option because annoyingly, life costs a lot of money.
I am dead inside.
The UK version then is very decidedly not a fantasy. Rather, it trades in a grim form of realism, even more depressing than Marx's very not fun telling, because at least in Marx, there's technically a way out. Spoiler alert, the revolution. But is the US office really all that different? On the surface, there are some clear parallels between the depictions of work on the US office and the alienated labor that Marx describes. Characters frequently express their disillusionment with their job.
No, I wouldn't say I have a passion for HR.
In early seasons, Jim is bored to death of peddling dead trees.
I'm boring myself just talking about this.
Pam complains about her life as a receptionist.
I don't think it's many little girls' dream to be a receptionist.
And even goes to art school for a bit before flunking out and then heading back. A bit like Tim's flirtations with higher education. The characters all perform discrete functions in the company and don't really understand each other's roles, and moreover, it's pretty clear that Dunder Mifflin's business model has become obsolete in the internet age.
By your own employees' calculation, you'll be obsolete in the next 5 to 10 years.
So it's clear that these characters often feel alienated from both the process and the product of their labor. And yet, for the most part, everyone on the show is doing pretty okay. They certainly live much less depressing lives than their UK equivalents. This is because while the characters do feel alienated from their work, this is where it stops. They don't feel alienated from themselves because they are not alienated from each other. In other words, work isn't totally destroying their souls or their senses of self. In fact, it's often a pretty fun time. In many ways, Dunder Mifflin doesn't resemble a workplace so much as it does a high school. Characters often seem to have little better to do with their days than to crush on each other, mess around, and get involved in personal drama.
He seems fine to me.
You're not his friend. You don't know. He is in love with a girl he works with who's engaged, so just cut me some slack, please.
Pam?
Through their relationships, the characters are able to show up at the office every day and feel, despite their work, like they are doing something meaningful. Compare, for instance, the super depressing quiz night episode of the UK office with the US episode, The Dundies. Both feature obligatory after-work events held in slightly depressing, unglamorous venues. But where Wernham Hogg's quiz night deteriorates into bad vibes...
Is this the first time you've lost?
We're not losing. The right questions aren't coming up.
And birthday boy Tim getting his shoes thrown onto the roof...
Oh, yes, looking good. Come on now.
The Dundies end up being a shockingly good time after Pam gets ripped on margs and re-energizes the night.
And I feel God in this Chili's tonight.
That work is not really the point of showing up at Dunder Mifflin can be perhaps best illustrated through Dwight. Unlike other characters, most obviously Jim, Dwight is enthusiastic about his duties to the point of psychosis. He loves the company and he loves selling paper, which he is depicted as being exceptionally good at. But crucially, Dwight doesn't really need this job. After all, he owns a farm/bed and breakfast/wedding venue. Even without Dunder Mifflin, Dwight and his cousin Mose would be perfectly able to sustain themselves, not least because they grew up in a close-knit community so insular that some members of it are unable to speak anything other than pre-industrial German. By the series' midpoint, the intensity of Dwight's desire to continue to show up to work is rendered even more absurd when he purchases the building. But for Dwight, the money is simply not the point. Originally sustained by his servile relationship with Michael, he later discovers meaning in his job through the authority he is able to exercise over his perceived inferiors, who have now, against all odds, become his friends.
Angela Schrute, my former accountant, is now my wife. My top salesman, Jim Halpert, was best man at my wedding, and office administrator, Pamela Beasley Halpert, is my best friend. Yes. I'd say I have gotten along with my subordinates.
It's also true that characters in the US office are able to derive some sort of identity through being employed by Dunder Mifflin because, frankly, the world they exist in is so much nicer and kinder than our own. It's set in a world where Daryl ends up transcending the barriers placed on him by race and class to land his dream job, as does Jim, who in the finale becomes magically able to juggle his family commitments with his professional dreams. It's a world where Ryan can criminally mess up his executive role only to be rehired by a manager who is blinded by genuine love for him. Where Pam is eventually able to become an artist and where Dwight is eventually able to become manager, despite at one point having shot a gun in the office.
Sorry I freaked you guys out.
Where even Andy's highly memeable breakdown can land him his dream job. The UK office ends with Tim and Dawn finally getting together, though one real scrap of light at the end of an otherwise dark tunnel. The US office, by contrast, ends with basically everyone ascending to some sort of dream life, regardless of whether or not they've actually done anything to earn it. It's a fantasy where a mediocre office job can provide you with an identity and make your dreams come true even if you don't actually do any work. But what do you guys think? Do we all secretly long to work at a place like Dunder Mifflin? Or are we just lying to ourselves about the possibility of having a meaningful work life? Let us know what you think in the comments. Big thanks to our patrons for supporting our labor. Hit that subscribe button like your Dwight tested and fire alarm, and don't forget to ring that bell. And as always, thanks for watching. Later. Because we're being paid to do something that doesn't really benefit. I said benefit is what I said. That's like a bento box that benefits you. Benefit. Okay, going back.